The Iron Compass sat 3 blocks from the main gate of Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, and on Friday nights it belonged to the kind of men who did not explain themselves to anyone. The sign above the door had been there since 1987, salt-faded and slightly crooked from a bar fight that became legend sometime in the early 90s. Nobody had straightened it. Nobody ever would. Inside, the air held the weight of a room where everyone had seen something they could not unsee. It smelled of draft beer and old wood and the faint chemical echo of gun oil that never quite washed out of military-grade jacket fabric. Classic rock moved through the ceiling speakers at a volume just low enough to let men talk without being overheard from the next table. The lighting was amber and forgiving. The bar stools were worn down to the shape of the men who sat in them most often. It was the kind of place that did not need a sign on the door saying civilians were not welcome. The room said it for itself. The woman who walked in at 9:47 that evening did not look like she belonged. She was 35 years old, though she moved like someone carrying a decade more weight than that. Her hair was light brown, pulled into a loose bun, with the efficiency that comes from doing it one-handed in under 10 seconds for years. Her scrubs were the pale gray of Coronado Medical Center, and they still carried the faint antiseptic sharpness of a trauma bay that had been busy for 14 straight hours. There were small, dried rust stains near the left cuff that did not come from anything in a hospital supply room. She had changed her gloves twice, and her awareness of those stains had not diminished once. Her name was Sarah Mercer. She did not look at the room when she walked in. She absorbed it, which was a different thing entirely. 3 seconds, one full sweep, soft-eyed and unhurried, cataloging exits and occupants and potential obstructions, the way a person reads a map before folding it away. 2 emergency exits, one in the back and one beside the restrooms on the east wall. 51 patrons, mostly male, mostly active or former military by posture and bearing. One man near the dartboard with a slight favoring of the left leg that suggested a knee replacement within the last 2 years. One man in the far corner booth who had not looked up when she entered, which was not the same as not noticing. She noted the corner booth man and moved to the bar. The dog at the end of her leash moved differently than she did. Where she absorbed the room quietly, he processed it with the absolute precision of a system engineered through years of training into something closer to instrument than animal. He was a German shepherd, 7 years old, black and tan, with the deep chest and squared-off head of a working dog rather than a show line. His name was Rex, and he had never been a pet. Rex walked through the door of the Iron Compass and stopped. His nose lifted. His gaze moved to the far corner booth, not to the man who had not looked up, but past him towards something that required no visible target. The fur along the ridge of his spine rose in a slow, deliberate line, like a warning instrument reading something just past the threshold of human detection. He did not growl. He did not bark. He stood there for 2 full seconds, with every fiber of trained attention locked onto a single point in the room. Sarah felt the tension in the leash. She looked down at Rex, then toward the corner booth. The man there had still not looked up from his drink. She said quietly, "Easy." Rex held the alert for 1 more second. Then he released it, settled back into his working posture, and followed her to the bar. His eyes did not return to neutral. They stayed at a frequency just above resting, tuned and patient, the way a loaded weapon is patient. Sarah took the 3rd stool from the end and sat down. Rex settled at her feet, positioning himself with his back against the bar and his line of sight covering the room. The collar around his neck bore a series of numbers etched in the metal beneath the standard ID plate, smaller than the tag itself, worn smooth at the edges from years of handling. The kind of numbers not put there by a civilian shelter or a breeder's registry. The bartender came over. His name was Briggs, and he had been working this bar for 3 years after leaving the 75th Ranger Regiment with 2 deployments to Afghanistan and a shoulder that would never sit quite right again. His forearms were covered in military tattoos that told a story nobody needed to ask him to explain. He had seen every kind of person this bar attracted, and he had developed the particular skill of reading rooms that former Rangers develop in lieu of therapy. He looked at Sarah. He looked at Rex. He did not ask what she wanted. He poured water over ice and set it in front of her without a word. She gave him a single nod, the smallest possible acknowledgement of a courtesy recognized. Briggs went back to polishing glasses and did not stop watching her. The group of Navy SEALs at the far end of the bar had been there since 7. There were 5 of them, and they occupied their section of the room with a kind of expanding confidence that pushed outward into space without noticing it was doing so. They were loud in the manner of men accustomed to being the most capable people in any given room, who have long since stopped moderating that awareness. The biggest of them was named Greer. He was built like something assembled for structural purposes. rather than aesthetics with forearms corded from years of rope climbs and combat swimming, and the kind of specialized physical conditioning that turns a large man into a different classification of problem. He had 3 bronze stars and 2 purple hearts and a laugh that had not changed since he was 22 years old and invincible. He was also at the moment running a performance for his teammates that required an audience. He looked down the bar at the woman in the gray scrubs sitting alone with her glass of water and her dog, and he decided in the reasoning of a man 3 drinks into his Friday evening that she was the most convenient available participant in whatever story he wanted to tell. He picked up his beer and walked toward her. He did not walk carefully. The beer came off his bottle at an angle that might have been accidental to anyone not paying attention. A solid pour of it landed across the left shoulder and arm of Sarah's scrubs, soaking through the fabric immediately cold and sharp-smelling. The group at the other end of the bar erupted in noise. Phones came out of pockets, screens lighting in the amber room like small cold suns. Greer looked down at her with the expression of a man waiting for a reaction he already knew he would enjoy. Sarah did not react. She reached for the napkin dispenser at the edge of the bar with her right hand and pulled 2 napkins free. She began blotting the beer from her sleeve with the slow, deliberate pressure of someone who had spent years learning to close wounds without wasting motion. Her movements were unhurried to a degree that was almost clinical. She did not look at Greer. She did not look at the cameras. Rex sat at her feet and did not move. Greer leaned in. His voice dropped into the register menus when they want to be heard by an audience while appearing to speak privately. He told her this was not a place for tourists. He told her it was for real warriors. He told her she should think about heading home. His teammates cheered from down the bar. Sarah blotted the last of the beer from her cuff and set the napkins flat on the bar. She picked up her water glass and took a slow sip. She put it back down with the same care she had used taking the napkins. Rex lifted his head and looked at Greer. Not a warning, not a challenge. The steady, patient attention of a predator at rest. Greer laughed louder and reached across to put his hand on Sarah's wrist. His fingers closed over the inside of her left arm just above the joint and found something there beneath the skin, a small raised circle of scar tissue, old and smooth, the diameter of something that had entered the body from the outside at high velocity and been removed later with difficulty by people who understood the anatomy of catastrophic injury. He registered it for approximately half a second. That was when the world rearranged itself. No one in the Iron Compass could reconstruct it cleanly afterward, even those who had been watching directly, even those whose phones had been recording at full frame rate. What the video showed when analyzed later was a seated woman and a standing man, and then a man face down against the bar surface with his arm torqued behind him at a precise angle that communicated without ambiguity that the joint was operating at the absolute limit of its structural tolerance. The transition between those 2 states lasted less than 2 seconds. Nobody saw her stand up. The bar went quiet in stages. First the group at the end, then the room outward from there like a sound moving through water. The classic rock kept playing through the ceiling speakers, but seemed to recede to become background rather than presence, the way sound does when the nervous system decides something more important is happening. Rex sat at the foot of the bar stool and watched the room. He was not tensed. He was not displaying. He was simply present, quiet, and complete, and requiring no further explanation. Sarah held the lock for 4 seconds, clean, controlled, efficient, in the manner of something practiced past the point of conscious thought, performed the way the lungs move of air, without debate or hesitation. She released Greer's arm and sat back down on the bar stool. She picked up her water glass. At the far end of the bar, Greer's teammates had gone still. Their phones were still up, still recording, but the atmosphere they were capturing had shifted from entertainment to something else, something they did not have a clean category for. Greer pushed himself upright from the bar. His face was the color of a man deciding between embarrassment and rage without having landed on either. He rubbed his wrist where her grip had left marks that would bruise by morning. He said it was a lucky shot. His voice carried the uncertainty of a man whose body had just told him something his brain had not yet agreed to accept. In 3 years behind this bar, Briggs had seen every kind of confrontation that military personnel and civilians could generate in a small space with alcohol involved. He had seen trained fighters and untrained fighters and men who thought they were one and were actually the other. He had watched a lot of people move in this room. He had never seen anyone move like that. He set down the glass he had been polishing and placed both hands flat on the bar. He looked at Sarah, who was sitting in exactly the same posture she had occupied before any of it happened, back straight hands around her water glass eyes, returned to their quiet study of the middle distance. Then he looked down at Rex, the collar. He had noticed it when she walked in cataloged and filed for later consideration. But now he looked at it directly. The ID tag with the standard information. And beneath it on the collar band itself, smaller and older, a series of numbers and letters etched in the metal in the specific format used by military working dog unit assignment tags. He knew that format. Every ranger who had worked alongside K-9 units in theater knew that format. The prefix was wrong for any current unit designation, not K-9 police, not traditional military working dog corps. Two letters and a hyphen that corresponded to a designation Briggs had seen exactly once before on a classified briefing document during his second deployment in a room where phones were not permitted, and the document was destroyed before anyone left. TFB Task Force Black. The year stamp beside the unit code read 2014. Briggs set the glass down very carefully on the shelf behind him. He did not say anything. He looked at Sarah Mercer, who was drinking her water and watching the room, and he understood with the clarity of a man who has been in enough situations to recognize the texture of one that he was in the presence of something he did not yet have the full shape of. He made a decision. He came around the bar quietly carrying a small canvas tote that had been sitting on the shelf below the register for the past several weeks, left behind by a customer who had not returned for it. He set it on the stool beside Sarah. Then he picked up a tray from the back counter, loaded it with 4 water glasses, and looked at Calloway's aide near the back hallway, a young officer who had been standing there since the confrontation began. "Back room's unlocked," Briggs said to him. "Someone's going to want it in about 10 minutes. The aide looked at him. Briggs returned to his position behind the bar. He took a small recorder from his shirt pocket, a device he kept for documenting end-of-night incidents, and placed it in the breast pocket of his bar apron, positioned upward, and walked through the door to the back room. He was in there for 40 seconds. He came out carrying the empty tray and resumed polishing glasses. Nobody asked him what he had done with those 40 seconds. In the corner booth, the man who had not looked up when Sarah walked in was no longer looking at his drink. He was on his phone, his voice too low to carry across the room, his body angled to keep the conversation private. He was 58 years old and wore the stillness that is not passivity, but patience, the composure of someone who had spent decades in environments where movement at the wrong moment meant death. His name was Donovan, and he had been a Master Chief in Naval Special Warfare before he retired. And he had been coming to this bar once a week for several years, looking for something he had not found yet. Greer had recovered his posture, if not his certainty. He moved back towards Sarah with his teammates closing behind him, and the structure of the confrontation shifted from individual performance to something more collective. The room had an audience now, and the audience had phones, and whatever happened next was going to exist in digital form before midnight. One of Greer's teammates said the word that tends to surface in these moments, the word about stolen valor, about people who claimed things they had not earned. In military spaces, that word had weight. It moved through the room and landed on the floor between Sarah and the group of SEALs with the density of something serious. Greer looked at Sarah and asked the question. Everyone who had served had a call sign. If she was who her actions suggested she might be, she would have one. If she was something else, now was the moment that would become clear. The iron compass waited. Sarah set her water glass down on the bar. The ice shifted inside it and clinked once, a small sound that carried in the silence. She looked at Greer. She looked at the room behind him. And then for the first time since she had walked in, her eyes moved to the corner booth where Donovan had been sitting. He had stood up. She looked at him for one beat. Something passed between them that nobody in the room could read, a recognition that had no obvious source. Two people who had never met registering something that operated below the level of introduction and explanation. Then she looked back at Greer. When she spoke, her voice was barely above the level of conversation. But in the silence of the iron compass on that Friday night in Coronado, it reached every corner of the room without effort. Ghost Zero. The effect moved outward from those two words like a stone dropped in still water. Greer had been raising his beer bottle toward his mouth, a gesture of casual confidence, the body language of a man waiting for an answer he expected to dismiss. His hand stopped mid-motion. The muscles in his arm locked as if the signal from his brain had been interrupted somewhere between intention and execution. The bottle tilted. His fingers, which had closed around glass with trained grip strength, capable of supporting his full body weight, lost their purchase. The bottle fell. It hit the floor of the iron compass and shattered, and gold liquid spread across the worn wooden boards in the silence. And Greer stood there with his arms still half raised, and his face the color of a man who has just heard something that has restructured the architecture of the last 10 minutes of his life. At the far end of the bar, one of his teammates made a sound. Not a word, just a sound. Briggs behind the bar stopped moving entirely. The glass he had been holding landed on the rubber mat with a soft click he did not notice making. His eyes were on Sarah, and in them was the expression of a man whose skill at reading rooms has just delivered information that exceeds the expected parameters of the situation. From the corner booth came the sound of a chair being pushed back. Donovan had stood fully, his phone no longer at his ear. He was looking across the room at Sarah with an expression that contained more information than most faces are asked to hold. Because Donovan was not looking at her the way the others were looking at her. He was not processing the name. He was not cross-referencing classified briefings or piecing together the architecture of a reputation built in rooms where identities were never written down. He was looking at Rex. The dog had turned his head at the sound of the bottle breaking and now sat with his attention on the room, still and professional. The collar caught the light. The numbers on the band were not readable from across the room. But the bearing of the animal, the precise quality of his posture, the way he occupied his position at the foot of the bar stool, as if he had been placed there by someone who understood exactly what placement meant in a tactical environment, all of that was readable from anywhere in the room to anyone who had ever worked alongside an animal trained to that standard. Donovan's brother had worked with a dog. His brother's call sign had been Maverick. Sergeant First Class Michael Donovan, Task Force Black, killed in action, October 15, 2014, in a valley that did not appear on any public map. Donovan had spent 10 years carrying that Tuesday in the center of his chest, and he had spent 6 of those years looking for the person who had carried his brother's dog out of that valley, because the dog had survived. He had known that from after-action reports he had not been authorized to read and had read anyway. The dog had survived and been listed KYE, along with everything else about that operation, and Donovan had spent 6 years believing that was a clerical cover-up rather than a fact. His brother had described the dog in the last phone call they had shared before October 2014. Described the way he sat, the way he monitored a room, the way he positioned himself at a human's left side as if that position were a coordinate on a map and he had been given its location and understood it was not to be changed. Rex sat at the foot of a Coronado bar stool with his collar catching the light. Donovan's phone clattered onto the table behind him. He took a step forward without deciding to. And Sarah Mercer, who had been watching him since she spoke the 2 words, who had registered his reaction before Greer's bottle finished falling, looked at him across the length of the bar with the expression of someone who has been carrying a weight alone for so long that the possibility of setting it down has become genuinely disorienting. The room between them was 30 feet of worn floorboards and split attention, and 50-plus people with phones recording something they did not yet have the vocabulary to describe. Rex sat at the foot of the bar stool with his back against the bar and his eyes on the room, patient and permanent and waiting. Outside, on the other side of the Iron Compass's salt-faded sign, a black SUV pulled into the parking lot and sat with its engine running. The driver's window was down 2 inches, and the man behind the wheel was on the phone, and the conversation he was having had the quality of urgency without elevation. A man delivering information to a superior who needed to move but could not afford to appear to be moving quickly. The name that moved through that conversation, spoken once by the driver and acknowledged once by the voice on the other end of the line, was not Sarah Mercer. It was Ghost Zero. And whoever was on the other end of that call was already out of their car before the driver finished speaking. The front door of the Iron Compass opened with the force of a man who had been running and was not yet finished running. Admiral Calloway was 61 years old and carried the frame of someone who had kept himself honest about physical conditioning long past the point where rank made it optional. He was in civilian clothes, dark jeans and a collared shirt with the top buttons undone, and he had the look of a man who had been sitting down to something else entirely when a phone call changed the composition of the evening. His hair was gray at the temples and shorter than regulations required him to keep it, the particular privilege of a man who had long since stopped being told what to do by anyone other than his own conscience. He stepped through the door and his eyes moved across the room in the same trained intake he had been practicing for 40 years. When they found Sarah Mercer on her bar stool, they stopped. Not with surprise, not with the recalibration of a man encountering new information. With recognition arriving on top of grief, which is one of the more complicated combinations the human face is asked to manage. Calloway walked through the room. The crowd parted without him asking it, to responding to something in him that operated below the level of conscious decision. He passed Greer, who was still standing in the wreckage of his own certainty, with beer spreading across the floor around his boots. He passed Donovan, who had moved 3 steps closer to the bar and now stood halfway between his corner booth and Sarah's stool, caught between forward motion and the awareness that this moment had dimensions he had not yet fully mapped. Calloway reached the bar. He stood before Sarah Mercer for 1 full second. Then Admiral William Calloway, 2-star flag officer, commander of Naval Special Warfare Command, lowered himself onto one knee on the floor of the Iron Compass, in front of a woman in gray hospital scrubs sitting on a worn bar stool with a glass of water and a German shepherd at her feet. The room did not make a sound. The phones were still up, still recording, and the live streams that had started as documentation of a bar confrontation were now broadcasting something the comment sections would spend the next 48 hours trying to find adequate language for. Calloway looked up at Sarah, and his voice, when it came, carried the weight of 10 years of a particular kind of debt. "Master Chief Mercer," he said, "I'm sorry, I should have found you sooner." Sarah looked down at him. Her expression did not break. It did not flood with relief or crumble with the release of something long held. What it did was subtler and more complete than either of those things. It settled. Something in her redistributed, like a load finally shared across a foundation that had been bearing it alone for too long. She said quietly, "Stand up, Admiral." He stood. Briggs set a fresh glass of water on the bar without being asked. His hands were steady. His face was the face of a man who understood he was witnessing something he would carry for the rest of his life, and who had decided that the most respectful thing he could offer it was his complete and undivided attention. Calloway turned to the room. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Copper Valley," he said, "October 15th, 2014. The name landed in the room with the weight of something spoken in classified briefings in unit rooms and late-night conversations where the official record and the actual record diverged in ways that nobody with a career to protect was willing to document. Some of the men in the Iron Compass had heard that name before. Some of them had heard only pieces of it. All of them understood from how Calloway said it that they were about to hear the rest. 6 operators, he said. 73 civilians. Aid workers, medical volunteers, and their families sheltering in a compound 40 kilometers east of a valley that did not appear on any public map. The intelligence assessment had described light resistance and minimal enemy presence. The intelligence assessment had been wrong in the specific and catastrophic manner of certain assessments, the kind of wrong that gets people listed as KIA, and then gets the listing buried under 3 layers of classification and a filing system designed to discourage inquiry. It had not been light resistance. It had been a trap. 250 fighters, heavy weapons, prepared positions. The compound was surrounded before the team's boots touched the ground, and the first 15 minutes of the operation produced 5 casualties among 6 operators, a ratio that existed at the outer boundary of what military mathematics considered survivable for anyone. The 6th operator had not died. The 6th operator had held that compound for 16 hours. Alone against everything assembled to destroy the team moving through a position that should not have been holdable by one person covering evacuation routes, that should not have been protectable by one shooter maintaining calm among 73 civilians who had no business remaining calm enough to follow instructions from a woman bleeding from wounds she had not yet counted. Rex had been with her through every hour of it, working without formal commands, operating on the trained instinct of an animal that understood the difference between a situation requiring aggression and one requiring precision. She had been shot 6 times. She had taken shrapnel from 4 separate detonations. She had been wounded 67 times by the official medical count conducted 8 days later at Walter Reed when she was stable enough to be assessed, rather than simply kept alive. She had loaded 73 people onto extraction helicopters. She had not gotten on herself until the last civilian was secured. Calloway stopped speaking. The room held his silence, carefully conscious of what would be lost if the grip failed. Sarah had not looked at him while he spoke. She had been looking at a point somewhere past the bar, past the amber bottles and the mirror running along the back wall, past the reflection of 50-plus people standing in silence. She was looking at something located in time rather than space. When she spoke, her voice was low and even, and it had in it the quality of someone choosing each word with the care of a person who understands that some things once said aloud in a room full of people become permanently part of the world in a way that cannot be walked back. "His name was Amir," she said. "He was 8 years old." Rex moved without drama. He shifted his weight from the floor, walked 2 steps and sat down again, pressing the full length of his side against Sarah's leg. His head came to rest across her knee with the quiet, deliberate weight of an animal that has learned through years of practice exactly how much pressure is needed and exactly where. Sarah's right hand moved to the top of his head. Her fingers found the familiar geography of it, the place behind the right ear, and stayed there. She kept talking. Amir's sister was named Layla. She had been 6 years old, and she had taken a round through the lower left leg during the first hour of the firefight when the southeastern wall was breached and the civilians were moved to the inner structure. The bone had not shattered, but the muscle damage was significant, and she could not walk under her own power. Amir had stayed with her. Through the entire 16 hours, through 4 attempts by Sarah to move them individually toward the extraction corridor, Amir had refused to leave his sister. Not with anger or hysteria, but with a calm and absolute conviction. That was the most adult thing Sarah had witnessed in a decade of operating in environments that aged people at accelerated rates. When the final extraction window opened, and Sarah had 3 minutes and 200 meters of open ground between her and the helicopters, she picked up both children. Layla across her left shoulder, Amir held against her right side, and she crossed that ground with every remaining fighter in the valley, tracking her across open terrain. Amir had been talking to her the whole way, not crying, not praying, talking, telling her he would be brave, telling her he would be brave like her. He was 8 years old trying to comfort the person carrying him through a killing field. That, Sarah said, is the only reason I got across. The room responded with the silence that is the most honest form of acknowledgement available to people who understand sacrifice and are confronted with an instance of it that exceeds their existing frameworks. Donovan had moved closer to the bar without being aware of it. He was standing 7 feet from Sarah now, and his face held something that had been building through Calloway's account and had reached with Sarah's last words a pressure that required release. He said quietly, "Maverick talked about you, said his dog worked like he could read her mind." He looked at Rex. He was right. Sarah's hand went still on Rex's head. She turned and looked at Donovan fully for the first time. Something passed between them that had the character of a circuit closing two people connected by a name that had not been spoken between them, but had been present in both their lives every day since a Tuesday in October 2014. Then the door from the parking lot opened and Colonel Hartley came through it. He moved with the ease of a man accustomed to occupying spaces without being questioned about his right to do so. He was 60 years old, silver-haired, with the clean jawline and controlled posture of a career officer who had understood early that appearance is a form of authority and had tended to it accordingly. He wore a dark blazer over a collared shirt and carried it with the ease of a man who did not need a uniform to communicate what he was. He greeted Calloway with the warmth of a man greeting a peer he has known professionally for 20 years. 2 handshakes and a shoulder touch, and then turned to look at Sarah with an expression calibrated precisely to the midpoint between recognition and courtesy. "Quite a reunion, Admiral," he said. His voice had the temperature of rooms where decisions are made. "Master Chief Mercer, it's good to see you back among the living." Rex came off the bar stool position in a single fluid motion. He was standing between Sarah and Hartley before the sentence finished his weight low and forward, and the sound he made was not a bark and not quite a growl. Something below, both a frequency that registered more in the chest than the ear, the warning an animal makes when it has moved past deterrence and is communicating that deterrence has been considered and set aside. Hartley looked at the dog. His expression did not change, which was itself an expression. Sarah's hand closed around the leash. "Rex." Flat and immediate. Rex held the position for 2 full seconds, eyes fixed on Hartley, with an attention that had no social component in it whatsoever. Then he stepped back to Sarah's side and sat, and his eyes stayed where they had been. Greer was watching the dog with an expression that had traveled a long way from where it started. He had been in the room long enough to absorb what Calloway had said, and he was reconstructing the last hour against the frame of that information in a way that was not comfortable. Rex's reaction to Hartley landed in the part of a trained operator that understands the difference between an animal performing aggression and an animal communicating something it knows. He looked at Hartley. He looked at Sarah. He did not say anything, but the alignment of his attention had shifted in a way that anyone watching carefully would have noticed. Briggs noticed. Sarah's phone rang. Not a standard ringtone. A single flat tone, twice the custom alert, assigned to contacts requiring immediate response regardless of context. She pulled the phone from her scrubs pocket and looked at the screen. The number that appeared was not a contact name. It was a sequence of digits with a specific area code that Donovan, close enough to see the screen at an angle, had not encountered since his last classified briefing 3 years before his retirement. Langley. Sarah looked at the number for 1 second. Then she answered. She listened. What left her face during that call was not emotion, it was color. the slow physiological withdrawal that happens when the body receives information it has to process before the face can decide what it means. Her hand around the phone tightened slightly. Her jaw moved twice in the way jaws move when the muscles are absorbing something the mouth has not been asked to speak yet. She said, "When?" She listened. She said, "How many?" She listened longer. Then she said, "Send me the package," and ended the call. The room was watching her. She set the phone on the bar face down and did not speak for a moment. Rex shifted his weight against her leg. She did not reach for him. She was still the way, still as different from calm, the way a person can be entirely motionless while something moves very fast inside them. Calloway said her name. She picked up the phone and turned it face up and showed him the notification that had come through with the intelligence packet. A four-line compressed summary assembled by people who understand that the person reading it needs the essential architecture of a situation rather than its full dimensions. Amir was 18 now. Layla was 16. After their resettlement through a State Department program in 2015, they had built something in Coronado, a small vocational training program for immigrant youth operating out of a rented building 6 blocks from the naval base. Amir had been scheduled to appear before a congressional subcommittee in 11 days to provide testimony regarding intelligence failures in classified operations between 2012 and 2015. 4 hours ago, both of them had been taken from the building by 4 armed men who had disabled the security cameras at the site 20 minutes before they arrived, 72 hours before they would be moved. And the FBI was, as the summary noted with bureaucratic phrasing, that meant exactly what it sounded like, currently assessing jurisdictional parameters. Calloway read it. His face underwent a reaction rather than performing one, the slower and more honest kind that happens when information arrives carrying the weight of things that came before it. Donovan had read it over Calloway's shoulder and stepped back. His hand went to his face briefly, the way hands do when the body needs to do something physical while the mind catches up. Hartley had not seen the screen. He stood 2 steps back from the conversation with the patient composure of a senior officer accustomed to being included. But something in the specific arrangement of his patience and how he stood rather than stepped forward had a quality that registered at the edge of Sarah's awareness and stayed there. She folded the phone into her palm and looked at the bar for a moment. Then she stood up, took the leash, and walked to the back of the Iron Compass without explanation. Rex walked with her. The back room of the Iron Compass was used for storage and on certain evenings for conversations that benefited from the absence of an audience. It had a folding table, 4 chairs, a single overhead bulb, and a door that locked from the inside with a deadbolt that Briggs had installed himself 3 years ago after an incident that never appeared in any incident report. Sarah spread the intelligence packet across the folding table without a map because she did not need one. She had the spatial memory of someone trained to build environments in her and navigate them without reference materials. She had the warehouse location from the summary, Chula Vista, a specific intersection, a building type, and approximate square footage. She had a timeline. What she did not have officially was authorization, clearance, active status, or a chain of command. She looked at the table and began to build the plan. Calloway came through the back door first, followed by Donovan, followed by Greer, who entered with the considered presence of a man who has decided to be useful rather than decorative. Briggs appeared last, carrying a tray of 4 water glasses. He set them on the table one at a time, placed the tray against the wall, and then did something no one explicitly watched him do. He moved to the corner of the room near the door, adjusted the water glass he had set on the corner of the table, and spent a brief moment with his back turned before taking his position against the wall. Nobody asked him anything. Hartley came through the door last. He looked at the assembled group and nodded once, the nod of a man joining a meeting he considers himself entitled to join, and said that whatever resources were available through official channels could be mobilized within 48 hours if the right requests were filed through the right offices. Hartley stayed in the room because men like Hartley always stayed. Leaving was the tell. Staying meant control or the appearance of it, which in his experience had served the same function often enough. Sarah looked at the table and began mapping approach geometry on the back of the intelligence summary with a ballpoint pen Donovan produced from his shirt pocket, the kind that writes under any conditions, in rain and cold and in the dark if necessary. The lines went down clean and certain because she had been building this structure in her mind since the moment the Langley number appeared on her phone and had been adding detail ever since. 2 teams, she said, not 2 equal teams. The first element would handle the warehouse. 4 people minimum, Greer, and 3 others from among the veterans in the room who had indicated, without formally volunteering, that they intended to be part of whatever came next. Their job was the building. Their job was Amir and Layla. Their job was to bring both of them out into a collection point 3 blocks east within a window she would define once she knew the internal layout more precisely. Rex would go with the first element. Greer looked up from the paper at that. Sarah met his eyes. She said Rex would lead entry. She said he would find them faster than any alternative and that his presence would matter to Layla in a way that no amount of tactical competence could replicate, because Layla had been 16 years old for 4 days and had been in a basement for most of them. And what she needed, along with the practical fact of rescue, was something that communicated safety in a language that operated below the level of words. Greer looked at Rex. Rex looked at Greer with the patient, assessing attention he applied to everything that moved in his proximity. Greer said quietly that he understood. The second element was 2 people, Sarah and Calloway. Their objective was not the warehouse. Their objective was the Iron Compass, where Hartley would return after the warehouse operation was complete, when the board looked different to everyone in it. What happened at the Iron Compass in the final stage of the evening would not be resolved through physical means. It would be resolved through the confrontation that happens when evidence and witness and live transmission occupy the same space simultaneously, and the person being confronted understands there is no longer any available response that changes the outcome. Donovan said he would stay at the Iron Compass as well. Sarah looked at him. He said his brother had been at Copper Valley. He said he had not been there himself and had spent 10 years with that fact living in him like a splinter that could not be located precisely enough to remove. He said this was the closest he was ever going to get to the valley, and he intended to be present for the end of it. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once and looked back at the paper. She said the timeline was 2 hours. She said everyone moved at 11, and the warehouse element needed to be complete and clear before midnight. She said anyone not prepared to operate under those conditions should say so clearly and without embarrassment, because the alternative to clarity was a problem that would develop at the wrong moment in the wrong location. Nobody said anything. She picked up the pen and capped it and set it on the table. Donovan placed something else on the table. A snap-on multi-tool, old and worn at the grip points in the specific pattern created by one particular hand over years of consistent use. A serial number scratched into the metal in ballpoint pen, not the manufacturer's number, but a personal one, the kind of operators sometimes add for identification in the field. Mavericks, Donovan said. He never went anywhere without it. Sarah looked at the tool for a moment. Then she picked it up and turned it over once in her hands, feeling the weight of it, the worn grip settling against her palm with a familiarity that had no logical explanation and a completely understandable one. She put it in her right jacket pocket and left her hand there for a moment before withdrawing it. She looked around the room once and then moved toward the back door. Outside in the parking lot, the night had committed to its temperature, and the Pacific moved 3 blocks west in the dark, and the sodium lights laid their orange geometry across the asphalt. Sarah stood for a moment just outside the door and breathed the cool salt air and let the evening's accumulated weight distribute itself before the next phase required her to carry it differently. Rex was beside her. She had not called him. He had come through the back door behind her without instruction, because in 10 years he had not needed instructions to know when she needed him near her, and he did not need them now. She was standing in the parking lot considering the operational picture when her jacket pocket shifted against her hip, and she remembered the canvas tote Briggs had brought her earlier. She pulled it open. Inside, wrapped in a piece of olive drab cloth that had been torn from military-grade fabric, was a piece of shrapnel approximately 2 inches long, irregular in shape, black and gray, and slightly rough on one edge. The cloth around it bore the dark stain of blood that had long since finished being red. She had not put this in the bag. She held it in her right hand for 2 seconds, and then it came. Not a flashback in the cinematic sense, not images. The sound first, the specific layered acoustic signature of a compound under coordinated attack at close range, and beneath it, a radio voice cutting in and out through interference saying her call signs, saying ghost, saying get them out, saying don't wait, saying it twice and then not saying anything again. She was standing in a parking lot in Coronado. She was also somewhere else entirely. Rex pressed against her left side before the piece of shrapnel had finished being what it was in her memory. His full body weight steady and warm and present, making himself available as a reference point, a physical fact that existed in the present rather than in October 2014. She put her right hand on his back. She breathed in 4 counts and out 8 counts 4 times in a row. The parking lot came back in stages. The asphalt, the sodium lights, the distant sound of the Pacific. The smell of ocean air and the residual warmth of a California evening that had not yet fully given up its heat to the night. She was in Coronado. Rex was with her. She put the piece of shrapnel in her jacket pocket across from the snap-on multi-tool. 2 weights, each of them earned. She straightened up and was preparing to walk back toward the building when Rex moved away from her side without instruction. He crossed the parking lot at a deliberate pace and stopped beside a dark-colored SUV parked at the far edge of the lot, the vehicle she had noticed arriving when she first came outside. He sat down behind the rear bumper and looked at her. Not alerting, not displaying, sitting in the precise manner he used when he had located something that required human attention and was waiting for the human to catch up to what he already knew. Sarah walked to him. She crouched behind the bumper and took out her phone and switched on its flashlight and directed the beam under the rear axle. The GPS tracker was matte black and approximately 3 inches long, adhered to the inside of the frame rail with a magnetic mount. The seal on the battery compartment was intact, the kind of factory seal that has not been broken by field maintenance, which meant the unit had been placed recently within the last several hours by someone with access to fresh equipment and the knowledge of where to put it. She held the flashlight steady for 3 seconds and took 2 photographs with her phone, one for scale and one for detail, the way she had been taught to document evidence in environments where evidence has a way of disappearing before anyone can act on it. She looked at the tracker. She looked at the parking lot around her. She looked at the front entrance of the Iron Compass, where Hartley had just emerged through the door and was standing on the step with his phone to his ear. His back partially turned, his posture, the relaxed posture of a man making a routine call at the end of an evening. Rex sat beside the tracker and looked at Sarah. He had known since the moment they walked through the door. She stood up and walked back toward the building. She did not remove the tracker. She left it exactly where Rex had found it, because a tracker left in place tells you where a person thinks they are in the game, and that information was worth more than the tracker itself. Inside the back room, she said nothing about the SUV. She filed what she knew in the same internal location where she had been filing her observations of Hartley all evening, and she kept her face exactly where it had been. And she moved the conversation forward to the tactical questions that needed answering before anyone left this room. The intelligence packet on the table had a secondary notification that had come through while she was outside, a supplementary note from the analyst who had assembled the primary document, the kind of addition made when something is noticed after the main file has already been sent. Sarah read it at the table with Hartley standing 2 feet away. The internal schedule document for Amir's program had been accessed 6 days ago. The credentials belonged to a colonel with Naval Special Warfare clearance. The query had been made from a device registered to a government building in Coronado. The timestamp was specific. The analyst had not named names. The analyst had not needed to. Sarah read the credentialed name attached to the query and set the phone face down on the table without expression. Across the room, Hartley was straightening his blazer. She did not tell him. She capped the pen and told the room the timeline was set. 2 hours. Then everyone moved. The warehouse in Chula Vista was exactly what the satellite imagery had suggested it would be, which was both a relief and a confirmation of the institutional competence of the people who had taken Amir and Layla, the kind of competence that plans from real intelligence rather than assumption, and sets up in spaces that offer structural advantage. The building sat on a commercial block, quiet at 11 at night, the neighboring units dark, the street lighting adequate but not generous. The 4 vehicles in the adjacent lot had not moved. Greer approached the east personnel door with the 3 veterans Donovan had assembled, with a series of phone calls made in the parking lot over 45 minutes, men who had answered immediately and arrived without questions, which was itself a form of answer. They were not in uniform. They carried what private citizens were legally entitled to carry in California, plus in 2 cases items that existed in a category private citizens were not legally entitled to carry and that nobody in the group acknowledged out loud. Rex walked point. He moved along the east wall of the building with his nose working the ground-level gap beneath the personnel door, and then the seam of the roll-up vehicle door, and then back to the personnel entrance building, the internal picture through air that moved through every structure, regardless of how well its human occupants believed they had sealed it. He sat at the personnel door and looked at Greer. 1 alert, 1 location, clear on the approach. Greer looked at the door. He looked at Rex. He had spent 12 years in Naval Special Warfare, and had worked alongside K-9 units on 4 deployments and had a professional's respect for the capability of a trained military working dog, a respect that the last 3 hours had moved from professional to something considerably more personal. He said very quietly to no one in particular, "All right." The door took 11 seconds. The building's interior was darker than the street. Rex moved inside, and Greer and the three veterans followed, and the door closed behind them without sound. In the basement, behind a steel door retrofitted into a structure not originally designed to have one, Amir and Layla had been there for most of 4 days. Amir was sitting with his back against the wall and his sister's head on his shoulder. Layla was not asleep. She had been cycling through the events of the last 4 days, looking for the moment where a different choice would have changed the outcome, and not finding it and cycling through again. Amir was talking to her in a low voice, not about the situation, about the program, about the students close to completing their certifications, about the lease renewal they had been planning to sign in 2 weeks, about the garden beds Layla had planted along the south wall, the ones she had been complaining were getting too much afternoon sun. He was keeping the present alive for her by populating it with specific details. He was 18 years old, and he was doing the thing that had been done for him in a valley 10 years ago by a woman who had told him she would always watch over him. When the steel door opened, the first thing through it was Rex. He crossed the room in 4 seconds and stopped in front of Layla, and did not demand anything of her, and did not perform concern, and did not need her to respond correctly. He lay down on the concrete floor beside her with his full body weight available, and his warmth present, and his breathing slow and even, and he waited. Layla was rigid for 1 second. 2. Then something in the architecture of her fear encountered the physical fact of the animal beside her, and found that the two things could not fully occupy the same space. She turned toward Rex and put both arms around his neck and pressed her face against his fur, and made the sound that people make when they have been holding something in for too long, and something real and warm and present finally gives them permission to release it. Amir looked up. Sarah was standing in the doorway. He looked at her for a long moment, not with surprise, not with disbelief, with the expression of a person whose internal accounting of the world has just been confirmed by an external event, the satisfaction of an equation resolved. He said, "You came back." Sarah crossed the room and crouched beside him and produced the snap-on multi-tool from her jacket pocket and applied it to the zip ties at his wrists with 2 precise movements. She said, "I said I would." Amir looked at the tool in her hands. He looked at her face. He said, "They knew where we were going to be. They knew the Tuesday schedule. Nobody outside the program knew the Tuesday schedule." Sarah cut the last restraint and looked at him. He said the man who had given the instructions over the phone had a name. He had heard it twice through the gap at the bottom of the steel door. The guards had not been careful about their phone conversations. Guards who believe the people they are guarding cannot hear them often are not careful. The name was Hartley. Sarah held Amir's gaze for 3 seconds. She said she knew. She said it was being handled. She said his job right now was to walk out of this building and get to the collection point 3 blocks east and wait there, and that everything after that was already in motion and did not require anything further from him tonight. Amir stood. He was taller than she had expected, which was an irrational thing to notice, because she had last seen him at 8 years old and had understood intellectually that 10 years would have changed the dimensions of him. But the mind holds certain images at fixed scale, and the image she had carried of Amir for a decade had a child's proportions, and the young man standing in front of her in the basement had his sister's eyes and his own stillness that was not passivity but depth. He said, "The congressional testimony. They took us to stop it." She said she knew that too. He said, "I'm still going to testify." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I know." Greer moved them out of the basement and through the building and out the east door with the efficiency of a man applying professional skills to a problem he understands completely. Rex walked beside Layla, matching her pace, which was slower than the group's pace because her leg, the one that had taken the round a decade ago, still moved with a compensation that surfaced under stress. Greer slowed the group without being asked and without drawing attention to the adjustment, and nobody said anything about it, and that was its own form of acknowledgement. 3 blocks east, a parking lot behind a closed hardware store. The collection point was exactly what it was supposed to be. Sarah was not there when they arrived. She was already on her way back to the Iron Compass. Calloway sat beside her in the passenger seat of her 10-year-old Honda, with the engine running quiet and the heater on low. He was looking at the road with the expression of a man who has been carrying the weight of a decision made 10 years ago and is about to watch its consequences reach resolution in a form he could not have precisely predicted, but had been in some formless way expecting. He said, "When this is over." She said yes. He said there would be a formal process. Documentation to correct records to amend an official sequence of acknowledgments that the Navy would have to make not quickly and not without friction, but completely. He said her retirement would carry full honors. He said Rex's service record would be restored and correctly classified. She did not say anything for a block. Then she said, Maverick's service record. Calloway looked at the side of her face. She kept her eyes on the road. She said Maverick's record needed to reflect what actually happened in that valley. Not the version that fit the operational narrative constructed afterward. The version where a sergeant first class in Task Force Black had spent 3 hours on a radio calling for extraction that was not coming and had spent every one of those 3 hours maintaining communications and coordinating civilian movement and doing his job with complete and absolute professionalism until he could no longer do it. Calloway said quietly, I'll make sure of it. She turned onto the block where the Iron Compass sat with its salt-faded sign and its lit windows and its parking lot where Hartley's SUV was still in its spot with the tracker on its frame rail and the photographs of that tracker on Sarah's phone. She parked 3 spaces down and sat for a moment with the engine off. Rex was in the back seat, still in the manner of an animal whose role has temporarily shifted from active to ready. His eyes were open. His breathing was the calm, even breathing of controlled readiness. Sarah reached back and put her hand on his head once. He did not move. She took her hand back. She got out of the car. The Iron Compass at 11:40 on a Friday night had thinned to its core population, the men who came because they had nowhere else that felt as honest, for whom the light and the music and the smell of the place constituted something close to home. Briggs was behind the bar with his laptop open at the end closest to the wall, the screen angled away from casual observation, a cable running from it to the router box mounted beside the beer taps. Donovan was in the corner booth he had occupied at the beginning of the evening, a glass of water in front of him that he had not touched. Hartley was at a table near the center of the room with a drink. He had been nursing a man in the practiced attitude of someone waiting without appearing to wait. Calloway entered behind Sarah and moved to stand beside Briggs without sitting down. He looked at the laptop screen. Briggs turned it slightly toward him. The stream was live, 47,000 viewers, a number that had been building since the earlier broadcasts of the bar confrontation had seeded across several platforms simultaneously. The chat column beside the stream was moving at a pace that made individual messages unreadable. Sarah walked to Hartley's table and sat down across from him. He received her with the expression he had used all evening, calibrated courtesy, the temperature of rooms where decisions are made. He said he was glad the warehouse situation had been resolved. He said these were the kinds of outcomes that demonstrated the value of experienced people working toward a common objective. He was reaching for his drink when Briggs turned the laptop so its screen faced the center of the room. The stream was showing a document. The document was the Copper Valley Access Log. It displayed in the date-stamped and credential-linked format of classified network audit trails a query made 6 days ago by a user whose credentials were Hartley's, whose access clearance was specific and traceable, and whose query had pulled the internal schedule document for Amir's program. Hartley looked at the screen. He set his drink down. The document cycled. The next item was the GPS tracker photographed in situ on the frame rail of his SUV, a scale reference visible in the frame, the factory seal on the battery compartment clear and intact and recent, the installation date confirmed by the seal condition as within the last several hours. Then the audio. The recording quality was adequate for the purpose, which was not broadcast clarity, but evidentiary clarity. The difference being that evidentiary only needs to be understood rather than enjoyed. The planning session played at the relevant section, Hartley's voice proposing official channels, and then it jumped forward to a portion from the parking lot, a phone call conducted by a man who had believed he was speaking privately at the end of an evening and had not checked his environment as thoroughly as the situation required. The name in that call was Amir. The instruction was time-specific and purpose-explicit and left no significant room for interpretation by anyone listening to it. 47,000 people were listening to it. Hartley looked at the laptop screen. Then he looked at Sarah. His face had arrived finally at something uncontrolled. Not fear in the visible sense, not guilt performing itself. Something more like the expression of a man who has maintained a particular construction for a long time and has just encountered the specific load that exceeds what that construction was built to bear. He said nothing. Sarah said, October 15th, 2014. You filed the intelligence assessment that placed our team in that valley. The resistance estimate was yours. The threat evaluation was yours. She paused. Maverick called for extraction for 3 hours. I was on the radio with him for the first 2 of those hours. I heard every call he made. Another pause. I want to know if you remember his name. Hartley looked at her. He did not answer. She did not need him to. Rex had come through the door of the Iron Compass behind Calloway and moved without instruction to a position between Sarah's chair and the center of the room. He stood there, not blocking and not threatening and not performing any visible aggression, just present, occupying his position with the complete, impatient authority of an animal that understands presence properly applied is its own form of power. He looked at Hartley. Hartley took one involuntary step backward. The chair behind him caught the backs of his knees, and he sat into it. And the movement was not chosen, it was produced by the interaction between a man's body deciding something his mind had not yet formally agreed to, and a chair being in the right place to receive that decision. The door of the Iron Compass opened. Two FBI agents came through it from the street side, and two more came through the back hallway door behind the bar, and none of them appeared to be in a hurry, which was itself a form of communication about the completeness of the situation they had been briefed into before arriving. Calloway had made that call from the car 22 minutes before they walked through the door. The senior agent went directly to Hartley's table. The procedure was standard and quiet and conducted with the professional efficiency of people who do this regularly and understand that efficiency itself is a form of communication, that the absence of drama conveys the totality of the institutional commitment behind the action. When Hartley stood to be cuffed, he looked at Rex one more time. He said, in a voice quieter than his voice had been all evening, the closest he had come to an unguarded register. "That dog was filed KYA in October 2014. Same as you." The bar heard it. The 47,000 people on the stream heard it. Rex stood in the center of the Iron Compass and did not react to being told he was dead. He had been dead on paper for 10 years. He had been alive for all of them. They walked Hartley out through the front door, and the salt-faded sign swung slightly in the night air from the passage of bodies and settled back to its crooked angle, the angle it had held since the early 90s, the angle nobody had ever straightened. Sarah sat at the table after the agents left. The bar around her released the breath it had been holding through the second half of the evening, the gradual return of ambient sound and movement that follows the departure of high-pressure situations. The classic rock resumed its low presence through the ceiling speakers. Somewhere down the bar, a pool cue clicked against a ball, and the ordinary sound of the room reasserted itself without embarrassment. Briggs closed the laptop. The stream had ended with Hartley's departure, which was the right moment for it to end. He went to the bar and poured 2 glasses of water and brought them to the table. He looked at Rex, went back behind the bar, came back with a ceramic bowl of water, and set it on the floor beside Sarah's chair. Rex walked to the bowl and drank from it with the unhurried composure of an animal that has done what it came to do and has now arrived at the part of the evening that involves water. Donovan came from the corner booth and sat down across from Sarah. He set an envelope on the table between them, the heavyweight official stock used for legal documents folded once along the center to fit in a jacket pocket. He said it had taken 6 months after Copper Valley was first opened for re-examination to locate the correct administrative thread. He said the Civilian Advocacy Office at the Pentagon had been, contrary to expectation, the most useful institution he encountered in the process, which said something about the difference between formal channels and the people operating within them. He said the military legal definition of missing in action had a specific and documented distinction from killed in action that had been incorrectly applied to Sarah's record in the immediate aftermath of Copper Valley, and that correcting that distinction had implications her official record had not yet reflected. Until tonight, he pushed the envelope across the table. Sarah looked at it. She did not pick it up immediately. She looked at it the way she had looked at the piece of shrapnel in the parking lot, with the attention of someone considering the weight of a thing before deciding to hold it. Then she picked it up and opened it. The first document was on official Navy letterhead referencing the corrections process for service member records under specific statutory provisions. The body of the document amended the record of Master Chief Sarah Mercer, United States Navy, from the erroneous classification of killed in action, October 15, 2014, to the correct classification of missing in action, October 15, 2014, with retirement status, effective immediately, all service benefits applicable, full military honors acknowledged. The second document concerned military working dog identification number TF-B-2-014-Rex, United States Navy, whose operational record had been similarly and incorrectly classified following the Copper Valley operation, and whose service was hereby recognized and honorably retired with K-9 veteran status formally established. The third document was shorter than either of the others. It amended the service record of Sergeant First Class Michael Donovan, call sign Maverick, to reflect the complete and accurate account of his actions on October 15, 2014. not the version that fit the operational narrative constructed afterward. The version where a sergeant first class in Task Force Black had maintained communications in coordinated civilian movement and called for extraction for 3 hours with complete professionalism and had done his job entirely and without failure until he was no longer able to do it. Sarah read it once. She folded it separately from the other two documents and held it in her hands for a moment. Then she set it on the table in front of Donovan. He looked down at it. He did not say anything for a long time. When he looked up, his face had the particular quality of someone who has been carrying something for 10 years and has just been shown that the record finally says the right thing. "Thank you," he said. Sarah looked across the table at him. "He earned it," she said, "every word of it." Greer came through the door at 12:10 with the three veterans behind him and stopped just inside the entrance. He looked at the table. He looked at Donovan. He looked at the bar, which had the quiet of something completed rather than merely paused. He walked to the table. He stood for a moment, the large man from the beginning of the evening who had spilled a beer on a woman in gray scrubs and said things he was now carrying in the specific and uncomfortable manner of a person confronting the gap between who they believed themselves to be and who the evidence of the evening suggested they actually were. He said, "Amir and Layla are secure. Both okay?" He paused. "Layla wanted me to tell Rex he can have the rest of her water." The room absorbed this. The corner of Briggs's mouth moved once behind the bar. He went back to polishing glasses. Greer looked at Sarah. He said slowly and without the performance of ease that had characterized his speech earlier in the evening, "I'd like to buy the first round next time, if that's something that happens." Sarah looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Water's fine." The corner of Greer's mouth moved, just at the corner. He sat down at the far end of the table, and that was enough. Outside, San Diego continued at the pace of a city that did not know what had happened inside one of its bars, which was to say, at the ordinary pace of a Friday night in late autumn. The Pacific turned its black water 3 blocks west in the dark. The lights of the naval base held steady and institutional on the other side of the main gate. The sodium lights of the parking lot laid their orange geometry across the asphalt where Hartley's SUV still sat, the tracker still on its frame rail, the evidence already uploaded and transmitted to multiple locations that would be difficult to simultaneously suppress, regardless of what institutional pressure was applied to the attempt. Sarah sat at the table in the Iron Compass for another hour. She drank water. Rex lay on the floor at her side with his chin on his paws and his eyes open, monitoring the room at the baseline. Frequency, the one just above resting, that would not fully disengage in any room containing more than 2 people. Shortly after 1 in the morning, her phone buzzed on the table. She looked at the screen. The number was one she had not seen before and would not see again from this device. The message was brief, 6 words and a set of coordinates in a format she recognized as Pacific Northwest. Ghost 0, Portland, children, when ready, blackjack. She read it twice. She set the phone face down on the table. She looked at Rex, who had raised his head when the phone buzzed and was now watching her with the patient attention he applied to everything she did, the attention of an animal that has made its decision about a person completely and without reservation and has never once revisited it. She picked up the 3 documents from the table. She put the first 2 in her jacket pocket across from the snap-on multi-tool and the piece of shrapnel wrapped in olive drab cloth. 3 weights, each of them earned. She placed Maverick's amended record back in front of Donovan. He looked at it. He folded it into his inside jacket pocket with both hands slowly, and he kept his hands there for a moment after it was done. Sarah stood. Rex stood with her automatic left side, the position he had not changed since she took his leash 10 years ago and had not needed to be asked to maintain since. She looked around the Iron Compass one last time, and what she cataloged this time was not exits and threat levels, but faces. Donovan at the table with his water glass, the man who had spent a decade looking for an animal that had spent the same decade keeping the only person still breathing from Copper Valley alive in the dark. Greer at the end of the table, large and quiet, his professional confidence, not diminished but reoriented, pointed now at something more specific than the direction it had been pointed before. Briggs behind the bar, cleaning glasses in the amber light, a man who had recognized something in a collar and known exactly when to act on it and exactly when to stay quiet, which was itself a form of service that did not appear in any citation. Calloway near the door, already on his phone, engaged in the sequence of calls that would produce over the following weeks and months the formal corrections and acknowledgments and the particular institutional reckonings that formal institutions produce when the informal record and the official record are forced by circumstances outside the institution's control to be reconciled. She picked up her phone from the table. She did not reply to the message. She put it in her pocket. She walked to the door of the Iron Compass, with Rex beside her, and pushed it open and stepped out into the San Diego night. The sign above the door swung once in the salt air off the Pacific. The light from the windows lay across the sidewalk in warm rectangles. Somewhere down the block a car started and pulled out of a parking space and moved away into the ordinary current of a city that would wake tomorrow and not know that a woman and a dog had spent one Friday evening becoming after 10 years of being officially nothing themselves again. Sarah walked east along the waterfront block with Rex moving at her shoulder. One step back and to the left, his collar catching the streetlight once every few steps in a rhythm that was not regular enough to be mechanical, but was steady in the manner of breathing, in the manner of the ocean. The persistence of something that continues not because it has been instructed to, but because continuation is its nature. She did not answer the message that night. She kept the number. And Rex, moving at her shoulder down the empty sidewalk toward the Pacific-scented dark, did not stop watching the road ahead.